Hi guys, back to our book The Witches by the author Roald Dahl, the person who writes the book, and illustrated by Quentin Blake, who's the person who draws the pictures. And remember, we were about to start reading the meetings. Remember, the boy is behind the the sliding doors, whatever they are, the bifolding door things, and all the women have come in and they're from the children's protection place, or so they say they are. This one's called The Meeting. Now that the manager had gone, I was not particularly alarmed. What better than to be imprisoned in a room full of these splendid ladies? Splendid, fantastic. If I ever got talking to them, I might even suggest that they come and do a bit of cruelty to children prevention at my school. We could certainly use them there. He suggested in his school is cruelty to children. In they came, talking their heads off. They began milling around, so sort of like pootling, sort of like touching things and moving around, and choosing their seats. And there was a whole lot of stuff like, "Come on, sit next to me, Millie dear," and "Oh, hello, Beatrice. I haven't seen you since the last meeting." And, "Oh, what an adorable dress you have on." I decided to stay where I was and let them get on with their meeting while I got on to my mouse training. But I watched them for a while longer through the crack in the screen, waiting for them to settle down. How many were there? I guessed about 200. The back rows filled up first. They all seemed to want to sit as far back from the platform as possible. There was a lady wearing a tiny green hat in the middle of the back row who kept scratching the nape of her neck. She wouldn't leave it alone. It fascinated me the way her fingers kept scratching away at the hair on the back of her neck. Had she known somebody was watching her from behind, I'm sure she would have been embarrassed. I wonder if she had dandruff. Dandruff's where you get dry scalp, and that can get very itchy. All of a sudden, I noticed the lady next to her was doing the same thing. And the next one. And the next one. The whole lot of them were doing it. They were all scratching away like mad at their hair on the backs of their necks. Did they have fleas in their hair? More likely it was nits. A boy at school called Ashton had had nits in his hair last term, and the matron, that's like the nurse, had made him dip his whole head in turpentine. It killed the nits all right, but it nearly killed Ashton as well. Half the skin came away with his scalp. Look, here's all the witches, all the women scratching their heads. I hope you're thinking what I'm thinking about why they're scratching their heads. I began to be fascinated by these hair-scratching ladies. It's always funny when you catch someone doing something coarse and she thinks no one is looking. Nose-picking, for example, or scratching her bottom. Hair scratching is very nearly as unattractive, especially if it goes on and on. I decided it had to be nits, and the most astonishing thing happened. I saw one lady pushing her fingertips up underneath her hair, and the entire head of hair, lifted upwards all in one piece, and the hand slid underneath the hair and went on, like this, and went on scratching. She was wearing a wig. She was wearing gloves. I looked swiftly, quickly, around the rest of the now seated audience. Every one of them was wearing gloves. My blood turned to ice. Because why do you think his blood turned to ice? Have a think. Why would your blood suddenly turn to ice? You suddenly went cold. Because you're scared. I began to shake all over. Was it because his blood was cold? No, it's because he's scared. He's shaking all over. I glanced frantically, panicked, behind me for the back door to escape through. There wasn't one. Should I leap out from behind the screen and make a dash, run for the double doors? Those double doors were already closed, and I could see a woman standing in front of them. She was bending forward and fixing some of the metal chain around the 2 door handles. Locking the doors. Keep still, I told myself. No one has seen you yet. There's no reason in the world why they should come and look behind the screen. But one false move, one cough, one sneeze, one nose blow, one little sound of any sort, and it wouldn't be just one witch that gets you. It would be 200 witches. At that point, I think I fainted. The whole thing was altogether too much for a small boy to cope with, but I don't believe I was out for more than a few seconds, and when I came to, I was lying on the carpet, and I was still, thank heavens, behind the screen. There was absolute silence around me, all around me. Rather shakily, I got to my knees and peered once again through the cracks in the screen. That's the end of that chapter. It was a short chapter today, by far the shortest. Oh goodness, the next one's really, really long. Really, really long, wow. Goodness me, that's a long chapter. Right, should we read another little bit? Because we've only been going for 6 minutes, and that's not very long for a day, is it? The next chapter's called Frizzled Like a Fritter. Frizzled like a fritter. All the women, or rather all the witches, were now sitting motionless, that's dead still, in their chairs and staring as though hypnotised at somebody who had suddenly appeared on the platform. That somebody was another woman. The first thing I noticed about this woman was her size. She was tiny, probably no more than 4.5 feet tall. Now I am nearly 6 foot tall. So to be 4.5 foot is very, very short. That's like probably about that much shorter than me. Some of you probably reach that. She looked quite young. I guessed about 25 or 6, and she was very pretty. She had on a rather stylish long black dress that reached right to the ground, and she wore black gloves that came up to her elbows. Unlike the others, she wasn't wearing a hat. She didn't look to me like a witch at all, but she couldn't possibly not be one. Otherwise, what on earth was she doing up there on the platform? And why, for heaven's sake, were all the other witches gazing at her with such a mixture of adoration, that's love, or like you want to be someone, and fear? So they're looking at her like they love her, like they think she's really, really amazing, they want to be her, but also like they're really, really scared of her. Very slowly, the young lady on the platform raised her hands to her face. I saw her gloved fingers unhooking something behind her ears, and then she caught hold of her cheeks and lifted her face clean away. She took her face off. The whole of that pretty face came away in her hands. It was a mask! As she took off the mask, she turned sideways and placed it carefully on the small table nearby. And when she turned around again and faced us, I nearly screamed out loud. That face of hers was the most frightful and frightening thing I had ever seen. Just looking at it gave me the shakes all over. It was so crumpled and so shrunken and shriveled. It looked as though it had been pickled in vinegar. It was fearsome and ghastly. Terrible. There was something terribly wrong with it. Something foul, disgusting, and putrid, rotting, and decayed. Another word for rotting. It seemed quite literally to be rotting away at the edges and in the middle of the face, around the mouth and the cheeks. I could see the skin all cankered and worm-eaten, as though maggots were working their way in there. There are times when something is so frightful, you become mesmerised by it. That means you're like in a trance, like, you You can't stop looking at it. And can't look away. I was like that now. I was transfixed. That means you couldn't stop looking. I was numbed. Numbed, like you can't feel anything. I was magnetised. Think about magnets and how they stick to metal. By the sheer horror of the woman's features. So the woman's facial features, the bits of her face. There was more to it than that. There was a look of serpents in those eyes of hers as they flashed around the audience. So her eyes are like snakes' eyes. I knew immediately, of course, that this was none other than, who do you think it is? The Grand High Witch herself. I knew also why she had worn a mask. She could never have moved around in public, let alone booking at a hotel with her real face. Everyone who saw her would have run away screaming. "The doors!" she shouted, the Grand High Witch, in a voice that filled the room and bounced around the walls, so she got a big booming voice. "Are they chained and bolted?" Locked. "The doors are chained and bolted, your grandness," answered the voice in the audience. The brilliant snake's eyes that were so deep in that dreadful, rotten, worm-eaten face glared unblinkingly at the witches who sat facing her. "You may remove your gloves," she shouted. But I show you that. They're allowed to remove their gloves. Her voice, I noted, had the same hard, metallic quality as the voice of the witch I had met under the conker tree. Only it was far louder and much, much harsher. So it was almost like a bit angrier. It rasped, it grated, it snarled, it scraped, it shrieked, and it howled. Everyone in the room was peeling off her gloves. I was watching the hands of those in the back row. I wanted very much to see what their fingers looked like and whether my grandmother had been right. Ah, yes, I could see several of them now. You could see a few of them. I could see the brown claws curving over the tips of the fingers. They are about 2 inches long, those claws, and sharp at the ends. So it's true, they have claws. And I am going to leave it there. We'll find out more about the witches and the meeting tomorrow. Bye guys!